Opening the central diagonal immediately asserts influence, aiming to unbalance the initial pawn structure and quickly develop pieces toward the enemy king. Immediately seizing control of central diagonal space, this aggressive Sicilian formation signals an imbalanced, tactical battle is on the horizon. Initiating swift development to contest the center and prepare kingside castling. Establishing a solid pawn center and preparing for further development, this knight boldly claims its stake in the dynamic fight for central squares. Opening the center immediately injects dynamism, forcing black into critical decisions about pawn structure and piece activity. Opening the central pawn tension, black accepts the challenge to exchange, aiming to disrupt white's immediate kingside development and gain a pawn majority in the center. Instantly claiming central dominion, the knight boldly occupies the open quarter, dictating play and preparing for further territorial expansion. Boldly seizing central space, black immediately challenges the knight's central outpost, initiating a dynamic battle for piece activity. Aggressively occupying the advanced outpost, this knight immediately challenges black's central pawn structure. Provoking the knight's retreat, this flank attack concedes central space but aims to disrupt white's piece coordination. Unleashing a decisive check, this knight's sacrifice boldly shatters black's pawn shield and forces the king into a precarious, exposed position. The immediate consequence is a significant disruption of black's defensive structure, potentially opening lines for devastating follow-up attacks. White aims to exploit the king's newfound vulnerability. Sacrificing development for material, black captures the knight, opening a diagonal for their bishop but leaving their queenside slightly underdeveloped and potentially vulnerable to a swift white attack. The queen's sudden appearance on d6, reclaiming material, immediately ignites a complex tactical skirmish, opening diagonals and creating immediate pressure on black's vulnerable kingside structures. Challenging the queen's reign, black repositions their most powerful piece to a more active square, eyeing the king's flank while simultaneously preparing to recapture central space and alleviate pawn pressure. Safeguarding the queen and preparing to develop the kingside seems to be the idea, though it relinquishes central influence for now. This retreat aims to preserve material and simplify after black's aggressive queen sortie, but watch out for black activating their pieces and potentially building a strong pawn center. The board's dynamism is shifting. White is opting for safety, which might offer black opportunities for initiative. Black repositions the queen, seeking a safer haven while keeping an eye on central squares, though it sacrifices tempo for queen activity. Re-establishing central influence, this knight's deployment aims to disrupt black's queenside freedom and prepare for a more active pawn structure, potentially targeting weaknesses around the black king should the center open up. Developing the knight to e7 clears the path for the f8 bishop and prepares to contest the d5 square, a vital central outpost. This knight offers potential support for a d6 pawn push or can swing over to the kingside for defensive duties. It's a sensible, patient maneuver in a slightly cramped position, prioritizing solidity over immediate aggression. Opening up the kingside with an aggressive pawn thrust, this aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially create weaknesses on the dark squares around the enemy king. It's a bold commitment, but it could lead to a dangerous attack if black doesn't respond with precision, especially as it challenges the bishop on g7 and eyes the weak h7 square. Preventing the pawn storm's immediate advance, h5 carves out crucial breathing room on the kingside, though it does create a structural weakness that might become a target later. Initiating development with a bishop maneuver, this piece aims to pressure black's central pawn structure by contesting the d6 square, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside and seeking to restrict the activity of black's queen. Black bravely strikes at the center, aiming to unravel white's pawn structure and gain breathing room. The knight on g7 is now poised to enter the fray, and the queen's potential retreat opens up lines for pieces to develop. This aggressive thrust, however, could also lead to a more open game where white's piece activity might become problematic if black isn't careful with their king's safety. It's a bold decision, gambling on creating counterplay before white can solidify their queenside advantage. Sacrificing the bishop opens up the diagonal for the queen and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Opening up a new diagonal for the queen, black bravely pushes the d-pawn, seeking to disrupt white's central control and create immediate counterplay. This pawn thrust not only gains crucial space in the center, but also challenges white's knight on c3, forcing a positional decision. The immediate threat is to dislodge that knight, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. It's a dynamic pawn sacrifice aimed at igniting the position and exploiting any potential weaknesses in white's slightly underdeveloped queen side. Unleashing an attack on the queen side, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the backward d-pawn. The bishop now eyes the potential weak squares around the enemy king, while the queenside pawns might soon become a target for further advances. The game abruptly shifts as black sacrifices a knight to disrupt white's queenside structure, seeking to create immediate complications. This bold action, while materially unsound in isolation, aims to exploit the awkward placement of white's queen and open lines towards the king. The ensuing play will depend heavily on white's ability to consolidate and exploit the material advantage, versus black's success in generating enough counterplay from the ensuing chaos. Opening up the b-file creates a dynamic imbalance, potentially offering white attacking chances on that flank while leaving black's king's pawn structure somewhat compromised. Black forces the queen to a more active square, attempting to disrupt white's queenside development and create immediate threats. This aggressive thrust, however, comes with a significant positional cost. The queen is now potentially exposed and might become a target. The central pawn structure is highly unstable, offering tactical possibilities but also demanding precise calculation from both sides. The game has entered a sharp, dynamic phase where immediate material exchanges could lead to unforeseen consequences. White must now decide whether to defend the king or exploit the temporarily misplaced black queen. Recapturing with the bishop here is a patient approach, prioritizing the development of your kingside pieces and preparing to castle, while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn and limiting black's central influence. This unhurried maneuver avoids immediate confrontation and sets the stage for a more strategic game, allowing white to consolidate and assess the evolving pawn structure. Securing the pawn and reinforcing the king's safety by offering this pawn structure presents an interesting strategic dilemma, as the king finds itself in a more exposed position. Unleashing the bishop to this square aims to disrupt black's burgeoning queen activity and prepare for pawn advances on the king side, potentially opening lines for an attack. Unleashing the bishop to pin the knight and create immediate threats forces white to confront the central imbalance. Observe how this bishop's placement disrupts white's coordination and opens avenues for counterplay, potentially exploiting the now vulnerable d3 pawn and threatening further disruptions to white's pawn structure. Asserting influence over the d-file and preparing for potential queenside advances, this maneuver also aims to unbalance black's rather cramped position, forcing a decision regarding the potentially exposed queen. Abandoning material with the queen exchange here, black seeks to simplify into a potentially favorable endgame, banking on the passed pawn on d4 to cause trouble for white's king, even if it means sacrificing the central queen. Opening up the c-file after a protracted queen exchange, this decision immediately grants your pieces greater reach and potential influence in the middle game, while simultaneously solidifying control over key central squares that black might have otherwise exploited. Liberating the bishop from its passive pinning duty on the dark squares, this maneuver now seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, though it sacrifices a knight in the process. King's safety now becomes paramount as the white monarch ventures into the center, trading queens having been a positional concession. Castling queenside is a bold declaration of intent, acknowledging the open c-file and preparing to connect the rooks for active play, while simultaneously tucking the monarch away from immediate dangers. Solidifying the central pawn structure and activating the rook are the primary goals here, aiming to leverage the open d-file for potential pressure against black's already compromised kingside. This knight's journey to the edge of the board may seem unusual, but it aims to solidify black's central pawn structure after the queen trade and prepare for a more active role, potentially eyeing the weak f2 square or supporting a kingside pawn push later. Unleashing the central pawn seeks to break open the position and exploit the currently uncoordinated black pieces, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and queen. Pivoting the knight to d5 creates a central blockade, immediately challenging white's d4 pawn and simultaneously offering defensive support to the queen side. Establishing a robust pawn chain and solidifying the center is the primary objective here, aiming to restrain black's mobile knights and prepare for a more active rook presence on the c-file, potentially challenging for control of that open highway. Preparing to contest the open e-file, black initiates a maneuver to shift the rook from its potentially passive h-file station, aiming for more central influence and potential pressure against white's pawn structure, especially the isolated d-pawn. Reclaiming the crucial central file, the rook slides to d1, aiming to marshal its forces and contest control of the open d-file, potentially preparing for a kingside pawn storm or reinforcing its central structure. Initiating a bold pawn advance to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for active pieces. This aggressive push aims to challenge white's pawn chain, forcing a reaction and creating dynamic imbalances. Black hopes to exploit the resulting pawn weaknesses or open diagonals for their pieces, particularly the knight on e7. It's a gamble, as it could also overextend and create vulnerabilities if not properly supported, but it injects immediate life into the position after a series of somewhat passive exchanges. The key will be whether black can adequately follow up and capitalize on any positional concessions white might be forced to make. Seeking to exploit the isolated pawn on d4, white repositions their bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to create pressure on black's queenside and potentially prepare for a centralized pawn push later on. The rook now anchors itself, creating a solid defensive wall while surveying the central files, a quiet yet crucial piece of infrastructure for future operations. Unleashing a pawn, white opens lines and challenges the knight's central perch, creating a dynamic imbalance that forces black into immediate defensive considerations. The rook's unexpected surge across the board creates immediate tactical complications, forcing white to defend their king, which is now exposed to serious threats from black's pieces. Relocating the monarch to the third rank, although seemingly a retreat, is actually a strategic maneuver to solidify its position and prepare for potential complications. The White King's journey to f3 serves a dual purpose. It brings the monarch closer to the center of the board, potentially aiding in defending the d4 pawn, and simultaneously seeks to avoid the immediate threat of the black rook and pawn battery on the e-file, creating a more robust defensive structure. This king activity, while appearing passive, is crucial for preventing black from exploiting the current material imbalance and opening up further attacking avenues. It's a subtle defensive posture that prioritizes king safety over immediate pawn aggression, recognizing that a misplaced king can be a fatal weakness in the ensuing battle. A clever redirection of the rook, aiming to harass the d-pawn and potentially establish a presence on the third rank, forcing white into defensive considerations. Asserting control over the central files is paramount, and this maneuver boldly re-engages the rook in the heart of the struggle, aiming to disrupt black's nascent pawn majority and potential attacking thrusts. Asserting control over the crucial fourth rank, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside stability and potentially create attacking avenues. Securing the open file, this repositioning of the rook aims to solidify control and prepare for potential action on the seventh rank, a vital corridor for imposing influence in the upcoming endgame. Initiating a tactical skirmish for control of the c-file, black boldly sacrifices the exchange to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to generate counterplay through active pieces rather than static pawn advantages. Seizing the open file and forcing the exchange with check is a decisive blow, eliminating a key defender and simplifying into a winning material advantage. Reclaiming the piece, the knight now anchors itself in a central outpost, immediately threatening to disrupt white's reorganized pawn structure and gain a foothold on the critical c3 square that was so recently vacated. Reclaiming the open file after the pawn exchange, white aims to activate the rook and threaten the lone knight, potentially forcing a favorable simplification or creating immediate pressure on the queen side. A bold attempt to revive activity on the queen side, but the king's exposed position on the c-file, now open thanks to the recent exchanges, presents a lingering vulnerability that might soon be exploited. Unleashing the bishop to its most dynamic diagonal, white aims to pressure the black knight's retreat and potentially disrupt the pawn structure around the kingside. The doubled pawns on the c-file will continue to be a significant structural weakness for black, and this maneuver doesn't address that fundamental issue. Assessing the board, *B strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing black's doubled pawns on the c-file and potentially creating threats against the isolated d-pawn. This repositioning aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open up lines for white's remaining pieces, signaling a shift towards more aggressive play rather than simply reacting to black's maneuvers. It's a subtle but potent attempt to gain a positional advantage by leveraging piece activity over immediate material gain. A desperate attempt to regain some positional leverage, though it sacrifices initiative and solidifies white's central pawn structure. Black risks becoming cramped while white consolidates and prepares to exploit the open files. Reclaiming the open file after the pawn exchange, a strategic regrouping to bring the rook into a more active position. This maneuver intends to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially create new avenues for attack on the queen side, forcing black to defend more actively. The knight retreats, seeking sanctuary on a less exposed square while eyeing the d5 outpost. This strategic repositioning signals a defensive posture, a prudent choice given the open lines and potential for white's rooks to infiltrate. It's a moment where black prioritizes solidifying their structure over immediate counterplay, acknowledging the delicate balance of forces in this increasingly tense middle game. The knight's new home on f6 provides some crucial defensive support for the kingside, indirectly contributing to the overall solidity of black's position. Bringing the king forward now is an aggressive gamble, inviting black's pieces into closer proximity and potentially creating targets, but also aiming to participate directly in the ensuing tactical skirmishes and secure a more active central post for the latter stages. Shaping the king's surrounding pawn shield becomes paramount now. g6* aims to fortify the king's residential square by preventing any immediate kingside incursions, while simultaneously creating a slight weakness on the light squares that white might try to exploit later. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure with f3 offers a crucial defensive foothold, preventing black's knights from easily infiltrating or creating immediate threats against your monarch. A knight repositions itself, preparing to explore the weakened queenside after the king's exposed journey. Consolidating pressure along the now open c-file, this redeployment offers the bishop improved scope and prepares for a potential pawn push on the kingside, aiming to restrict black's knight and potentially open lines against their somewhat exposed monarch. Embracing the open file with the rook, black aims to disrupt white's queen's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay, forcing white to make immediate decisions about defending the central pawn and potential king's safety. Shaping the pawn structure for a potential kingside attack, this maneuver aims to open lines for your remaining pieces and create a safe haven for your king on the g2 square, far from black's active pieces. The rook's repositioning to the second rank creates immediate pressure on white's vulnerable doubled pawns and hints at a potential infiltration into the opponent's territory, aiming to disrupt their already compromised pawn structure and possibly exploit the loose knight. The monarch ventures into the skirmish zone, a bold gambit to rally his besieged pawns and inject some dynamism into the king's flank, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated assault by offering a daring positional challenge. The king's exposed position on g5 becomes an immediate target, inviting a swift counterattack that could disrupt white's entire queenside structure. Unlocking the c-file for your rook is the immediate priority, and positioning the bishop on f4 is a crucial preparatory step, even if it seems passive for the moment. The knight's repositioning to f8 is a concession, a retreat dictated by the pressure on the queenside and the compromised pawn structure, seeking a less exposed square to regroup and potentially defend the kingside. Initiating a flank assault with the rook on the 6th rank aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around their isolated king. The rook's relentless advance along the open file finds its path blocked, forcing a strategic reassessment of black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses for white to exploit. The white king voluntarily marches into a dangerous frontier, offering a target in exchange for a potential centralizing advantage. It's a bold gamble aiming to activate the monarch in a position where black's pieces are surprisingly sluggish. This pawn push brings the rook to a more active square, but its true purpose remains elusive as it ventures towards the queen side, seemingly without immediate threats or clear defensive coordination. Reclaiming the outpost on the 2nd rank, the rook now aims to solidify its presence, potentially preparing to support a pawn push or join the fray on the king side, while simultaneously preventing any sneaky infiltrations by black's knight. Re-establishing a defensive perimeter becomes paramount as the black king seeks refuge on the 2nd rank, aiming to consolidate after the recent pawn thrusts. The bishop's repositioning to d6 aims to create a dynamic outpost and potentially squeeze the black knight's mobility on f8. A desperate attempt to stir up trouble and perhaps force white's king into a more exposed position, though the current board state offers little immediate hope of a significant shift in momentum. The white monarch is now exposed to a potential mating net, a risky adventure in the midst of this tense struggle. The rook's repositioning towards the king's flank, away from the central confrontation, signals an intention to potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around white's monarch, though it neglects the crucial open central files. Initiating a bold pawn sacrifice to pry open the b-file, aiming to generate activity against black's potentially exposed king side. Aggressively pushing forward on the king side, black throws caution to the wind, sacrificing a pawn to open up attacking avenues against white's king. This bold gambit seeks to disrupt white's carefully constructed defensive setup and inject some much-needed dynamism into the position, potentially creating complex tactical situations where white might falter under pressure. Slamming the bishop onto f4, white initiates a decisive pawn push in the center, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure and expose the beleaguered king. This aggressive maneuver seizes the initiative, forcing black to react defensively and potentially opening lines for white's remaining forces. The game shifts dramatically towards an attacking phase. Unleashing a final, desperate check, black forces white's king into a precarious defensive position, aiming to disrupt any lingering coordination before the inevitable material collapse. The king ventures into a precarious corner, exposing itself to potential harassment as black's rook solidifies its position on the 7th rank. Black's pawn thrust on the queenside aims to create dynamic counterplay and seize initiative in what has become a rather unbalanced pawn structure. The bishop returns to d6, solidifying control over the c5 square and preparing to potentially shuttle back to e5 if the knight dares to move again, while also keeping a watchful eye on the king side. Black seeks to widen the pawn chain, aiming to create immediate threats and potential passed pawns on the queen side, a direct counter to white's positional setup. Pressing on the king side, this advance seeks to disrupt black's rook and potentially open lines for attack. The immediate capture of the pawn at f3 opens up a dangerous diagonal for the black rook, potentially creating mating threats or forcing white into a passive defensive posture. However, it also allows white's bishop on d6 to become an active attacking piece once again, and the pawn on g4 is now unprotected, which might offer tactical opportunities for white to exploit. The king's safety of both sides remains a significant concern, with black's king appearing more exposed in the center, while white's monarch is somewhat protected by its pawn shield, but still vulnerable to long-range threats. The pawn push here aims to solidify white's central structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the g-file, disrupting black's pieces and offering a new avenue for attack. The knight's relocation to e6 immediately bolsters the pawn chain on the king side, creating a formidable defensive barrier and preparing to support potential advances. King hunts now escalate in a wild, open terrain threatening to corner the black monarch amidst its own collapsing defenses. A desperate attempt to shore up the crumbling kingside defense by interposing the rook on the third rank, hoping to create some sort of barrier against the encroaching white pieces. A belated repositioning of the bishop, aiming to disrupt the pawn chains and potentially exploit the exposed black king, though it leaves the queenside rather porous and reliant on king activity. The rook now finds refuge on the third rank, an active square offering potential pressure and support, while simultaneously denying white's king a crucial escape route. King repositioning initiates a fight for central control, aiming to consolidate the advantage gained by black's queen sacrifice. The knight's redeployment to f8 is a cautious retreat, aimed at defending the pawn on g6 and potentially supporting a future push on the kingside. It withdraws from immediate tactical skirmishes, signaling a shift towards positional maneuvering rather than direct confrontation. Unleashing the rook from its cramped position allows it to pressure the f4 pawn, a critical target in black's otherwise solid structure, while simultaneously preparing to infiltrate black's queenside. The king finds itself under siege on the 7th rank, with the black rook delivering a crucial check that forces the white king to relocate, potentially exposing it further to the approaching pawn storm and hindering any immediate defensive maneuvers. The bishop's retreat to the f4 square reestablishes a vital defensive shield for the king, while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial d-file and aiming to disrupt black's rook's mobility, a seemingly small repositioning that holds significant strategic implications in this complex endgame. The black king, finally escaping its cramped quarters, now ventures towards the center, aiming to participate more actively in the unfolding endgame, opening the path for the rook to create chaos on the queenside. The knight's retreat to e6 signals a shift in focus, aiming to consolidate the position and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside, as the rooks are currently well placed to control the central files, suggesting a buildup of pressure. Unleashing a pawn's final surge, this gambit aims to pry open black's defenses and force an inevitable queen trade, aiming for a simplified position where white's passed pawn can hopefully dominate. Sacrificing the rook opens a dynamic pathway for the knight, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure and potentially create mating threats or win material. The white king bravely ventures forward, a bold decision that could lead to either a swift victory or a swift downfall, as it now becomes a target for the active black pieces. The black king, now exposed and desperately seeking safety, must immediately retreat or face an even greater onslaught. Transforming the pawn into a queen is a pivotal moment, instantly shifting the material balance and opening up a wealth of attacking possibilities that black's severely weakened king will struggle to defend against. The knight's final leap, a desperate attempt to cling to the board's edge, signals a futile quest for counterplay against the unstoppable queen promotion. The reigning monarch ventures into the heart of enemy territory, a bold maneuver signaling a decisive push for victory, aiming to secure crucial central squares and potentially unleash a devastating attack on the opposing army. A sudden aggressive push on the queenside, aiming to create immediate counterplay and potentially open lines against the white king, though it risks leaving black's own king somewhat exposed should white manage to consolidate. The monarch is forced out to the queenside, where it can finally see some action. The white king, having achieved a precarious outpost, now faces a race against the black monarch's consolidation. Black's response aims to activate their remaining pieces and contest the central advance, seeking to prevent the white king from becoming an unassailable attacking force. Centralizing the king offers crucial support for the advancing pawn and prepares to contest the crucial diagonal. This pawn push aims to disrupt white's central control and create a passed pawn on the queenside, potentially opening lines for the black rook to become more active. Securing the queen's pawn provides vital support for your rook, preparing to advance on the queenside.